Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into an era of smoke, steel, and massive upheaval. We're going to explore how the incredible wealth and, quite frankly, the grueling human cost of the Industrial Revolution forged the economic and cultural systems that literally still govern our entire world today. It's a cinematic, sweeping era of history, so let's get right into it. So to set our historical stage, we really have to look at a stark, almost unbelievable contrast. On one side, you have the unprecedented prosperity and capital accumulation generated by early factory owners, the capitalists. But on the other side, we see a much harsher reality. The enclosure movement in Britain displaced traditional rural farmers, pushing them into heavily overcrowded, heavily polluted industrial cities like Manchester and Birmingham. It was this era of incredible, world-changing innovation, but it was also one of impossibly long hours, low wages, and truly dangerous conditions for everyday people. Think about the sheer speed of this historical roadmap. Look how tightly packed these explosive ideas actually are. In just a few decades, we go from the foundational economic theories of 1776 directly into a wave of passionate cultural pushback in 1798, and then straight into radical, revolutionary political ideologies by 1848. These weren't just books sitting on a shelf. They were blueprints that completely changed the trajectory of human history. So let's unpack the foundational idea that started it all: capitalism and the concept of laissez-faire. Back in 1776, Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, where he argued that free markets, guided by the invisible hand of competition, naturally produce prosperity. He was a massive champion of entrepreneurship and believed that minimal government interference in trade and investment was absolutely the best way to generate wealth for a nation. Section 1. The Romantic Rebellion. Art against the machine. Now, this cold, industrial logic of constant production and capital accumulation, it didn't sit well with everyone. Enter Romanticism. And just to be clear, the core of Romanticism wasn't about romance in the way we use the word today. It was a massive, Europe-wide cultural movement, a direct, vocal rejection of Enlightenment rationalism, which was the era's total obsession with scientific progress, machines, and cold logic. Romantic artists and writers felt that industrialization was actively damaging the human spirit, and they countered it by fiercely emphasizing nature, pure emotion, and individualism. English writers really championed this pushback. In 1798, William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge dropped lyrical ballads. They deliberately used ordinary, everyday language to elevate profound human feeling and the sublime natural world. Their goal? To pull people's attention away from the smog-filled, overcrowded skies of cities like London and remind them of the raw power of the natural environment. And nothing illustrates the era's deep cultural anxieties quite like this next one. In 1818, a teenage Mary Shelley published Frankenstein. It wasn't just a scary story. It was a profound, biting question. Does scientific ambition, when stripped of moral reflection, inevitably lead to disaster? Shelley was essentially warning a rapidly industrializing society about the very real dangers of creating technological monsters that we can no longer control. Visual artists were echoing this exact same sentiment, creating incredibly cinematic, dramatic works of art. You had J.M.W. Turner painting scenes like rain, steam, and speed, capturing the sheer, terrifying force and chaos of the new railway age. Meanwhile, artists like Caspar David Friedrich painted awe-inspiring, sublime landscapes where tiny human figures were just utterly dwarfed by the raw, majestic power of nature. It was essentially a visual protest against the ugly, mechanical, industrial aesthetic. Section 2. Radical economic alternatives from utopian socialism to Marxism. While the artists were painting their discontent, early critics of capitalism were brainstorming entirely new systems. And they did not want violence. Many wanted perfectly engineered harmony. We call this utopian socialism. Thinkers like Robert Owen in Scotland actually built experimental cooperative mill towns like New Lanark. He argued that rational planning could entirely eliminate the miseries of the working class. The core idea here was that poverty simply wasn't inevitable if society was structured cooperatively. But, of course, others took a far more radical, revolutionary stance. In their 1848 Communist Manifesto and later Das Kapital, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels argued that all of human history is driven by class struggle. specifically the conflict between the bourgeoisie, the wealthy capitalist owners, and the proletariat, the exploited workers. Marx argued that capitalism inherently exploited labor and that it would eventually, and inevitably, collapse entirely. So let's impartially map out these three competing economic ideologies side by side to really see the stark differences. We have capitalism, rooted in Adam Smith's free markets and private ownership. Then, utopian socialism, seeking cooperation and rational community planning. And finally, communism, demanding revolutionary change and total collective control of production. Make no mistake, these are the three pillars of economic debate that would totally dominate the next century and a half. Section 3. Social reform and labor, the struggle for rights and dignity. These intense ideological debates didn't just stay in academic books. They spilled right out into the streets, and literature became a highly effective weapon for social change. The relentless social criticism from naturalism authors raised immense public awareness. William Blake's poetry directly condemned child labor. Charles Dickens's classic novels like Oliver Twist and Bleak House viciously attacked poverty and class inequality. Elizabeth Gaskell made readers truly feel the human cost of capitalism, and Émile Zola exposed the brutal, dark reality of French coal mines. They basically forced society to look directly at its darkest corners. And we can trace a direct three-step path from this cultural awakening to tangible reform. Step 1, literature and art build massive public awareness of industrial misery. Step 2, this awareness empowers the working class, eventually leading to the legal recognition of labor unions across Europe. And Step 3, these unions fight for and eventually win monumental protections, things we totally take for granted today, like shorter workdays and vastly improved factory safety conditions. When we move over to the political sphere, we see a really fascinating split in tactics among reformers. On one hand, you had explosive revolutionary working class action, which is best demonstrated by the Paris Commune of 1871. But on the other hand, you had the rise of social democracy. Thinkers like Edward Bernstein in Germany and the Fabian Society in Britain argued that socialism shouldn't come from violent revolution at all, but rather through gradual, peaceful reform via democratic elections. Meanwhile, that cultural pushback we talked about earlier continued to evolve, leading to the aesthetic arts and crafts movement. The prominent figure here, William Morris, along with the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, completely rejected ugly, mass-produced industrial design. Instead, they looked back to medieval craftsmanship, pushing for design reform to restore beauty and dignity to skilled labor and everyday objects. This fundamentally shifted public opinion toward respecting workers' crafts again. And that brings us to Section 4, the modern legacy, echoes of the 19th century. So how did these 19th century clashes between extreme wealth and crushing poverty, between humans and machines, permanently shape our modern world? Well, the legacy is absolutely massive. Capitalism became the dominant global engine, driving unparalleled industrialization and technological innovation throughout the 20th century. But that friction between capitalism and communism ultimately defined the post-1945 Cold War. Furthermore, the push for reform gave rise to modern social democratic parties and welfare states. Today, almost all of us live in mixed economies, systems that carefully try to blend Adam Smith's free markets with government regulation to protect everyday citizens. Culturally speaking, the DNA of the Romantic era is still everywhere. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein didn't just capture 19th century anxiety, she basically founded the entire modern genre of science fiction, where we still fiercely debate the ethics of technology today. And William Blake and Charles Dickens, they aren't just historical footnotes. Their works remain essential, foundational texts read in classrooms worldwide whenever we discuss poverty, naturalism, and social reform. Which leaves us with a fascinating and honestly a highly relevant final question to consider. As we face our own era of massive, unprecedented technological upheaval, from artificial intelligence to automation, which of these 19th century responses are we going to repeat? Will our society lean entirely on the capitalist invisible hand, trusting the market to sort out the human cost? Or as the machines get smarter and faster, are we overdue for a brand new romantic rebellion? Thanks for exploring this history with us on The Explainer, and we will see you next time.